When Toaplan, one of the premier developers of 2D shooters from the late 80s and early 90s, went out of business, its talented workforce wasted little time in finding new vocations, with some having seen the writing on the wall and leaving before bankruptcy was officially declared. While certain Toaplan employees would choose to form their own companies, which is how Cave was birthed, others would find employment for already existing concerns. It should be of no surprise that Taito would be the eventual destination for some, owing to the well-established relationship between the two companies, with the majority of Toaplan's games being published by the veteran company in Japan. Throughout their existence, Taito have explored the shooter through a steady drip of releases, being the company who created the game's doyen in Space Invaders, so it makes sense that they would utilise the STG specialists from Toaplan in the development of Gekirindan. The resulting work, however, is a rather undistinguished game with very little going for it, that didn't stand out from the crowd in 1995, and even less so today. The majority of footage that you'll see in this video was taken from the arcade version of the game, emulated in MAME. Being a Tate shooter, I must apologise for the presentation of the gameplay, so thank you for your understanding. The game's plot is simplistic. In the year 3195, a time machine is developed, only for it to be almost immediately purloined by a mechanical being called, wait for it, Huge Boss. After your initial confrontation with Huge Boss, it activates the time machine and begins a merry jaunt through history, inciting havoc whenever it goes. Your objective is naturally to pursue this entity and recover that which it stole. While this epoch-spanning journey may be completely devoid of originality, the premise does allow for a variety of level settings, all of which are a thematic fit thanks to the time travel plot device. So while 1 minute you're destroying asteroids in the depths of space, only to be gunning down biplanes in the subsequent level, there is at least reasonable justification for this drastic shift in scenery and adversaries. Of course, being an arcade game, most of this information is only communicated through external materials such as flyers, rather than actually in-game, as this would only serve to waste time and prolong the period between money being deposited into the machine. Like the story, gameplay in Gekirindan doesn't offer anything you haven't seen before. In fact, it doesn't offer much of anything at all. Your shot type is determined by the character that you pick, with there being 3 to choose from, although the characters and potency of the shot does differ depending on whether you're on the player 1 or player 2 side. More on the significance of that later. The shots available are the standard suite, from a less powerful, wider spread of fire, to a stronger but also more concentrated option. Ship speed is fixed, and is the same irrespective of the avatar you select. With no in-game dialogue, the only difference between characters is their shot type, and the sprite that you get to control. The shot types are the first example of why I believe that, although this game may be lacking in many areas, it can still serve a purpose as a good introductory shooter for newcomers of the genre. By removing factors such as speed, players can choose simply based on whether they prefer the ease of being able to hit more enemies at once, or want to put in the effort of manoeuvring more with the reward of higher damage output. Your shot can be enhanced multiple times with power-ups dropped by certain passive ships or hidden indestructible structures, with firepower being greatly diminished upon death. While each ship may only be equipped with a single weapon and a limited stock of screen-clearing bombs, note the similarity between the bomb of the Type A ship to that of Truxton's. You can contemper this weapon by collecting the C items that can be located throughout each level. This offers alternative firepower that isn't necessarily better or worse, but just gives extra choice to the player, who may prefer to use one or the other depending on the situation at hand. One of 3 secondary weapons can also be acquired: a homing laser, 2 small bombs, again straight out of Truxton, that fire at 45-degree angles, and missiles. These can all be obtained from the same icon, which changes over time if it is left uncollected. This offers even further choice to the player, and when coupled with a number of shot types available, equates to a substantial variety of weapon combinations to uncover and experiment with. Once again, while there is some decision making to be done by the player in how they wish to arm themselves, the mechanics are made very accessible for those less acquainted with shooters, or for people who just want to enjoy a less complex take on the genre. There is a slight issue, however, that pertains to all I have just said about shot types and player choice. Sure, you can choose which character you want to play as, whether you want to use their primary or alternate weapon, which secondary power-up you wish to use. But what you're probably going to do is pick the Type C ship on the Player 2 side and not concern yourself with anything else. This ship obliterates any notion of balance that the game may have had. Not only does it enjoy a very wide spread of fire capable of taking out swaths of foes simultaneously, but the damage it causes far exceeds that of all others. Many enemies won't even get a chance to retaliate because they can be destroyed so quickly, and even the bosses crumble before the puissant might of pilots Orsa and Meodu. Certain boss attack patterns can be outright skipped due to the rate of damage you're able to dish out, and some can even be destroyed before they're able to unleash their full arsenal. Even without this apocalypse-inducing spacecraft, Gekirindan surprises with its lack of challenge, which is in stark contrast to the rest of Toaplan's portfolio that demonstrates a great understanding of difficulty in both balanced and very cheap forms. There just isn't much to threaten you here. Many opposing craft don't even seem to be equipped with weaponry, instead making a beeline for you, only to be gunned down before they can make contact. While this bum rush strategy may be expected in the opening stage, the final level still has these suicidal foes, who are no more of a menace at the game's end than they were at the outset. Furthermore, many enemies that are blessed with armaments will refrain from using them unless they're within the visible play area. Most stages are slightly wider than the screen can display, so left and right movement will also shift the background, and often reveal additional foes. However, if a ship was about to take fire at you, but you're able to move so that its sprite is no longer visible, the attack will be called off. This means certain sections can be made all the more easier by hugging the left or right side of the screen, nullifying any potential attacks from the opposite side. Of course, this more pacifist style isn't for those looking to maximise their score, but can be utilised by those who are more interested in survival. Any semblance of difficulty that can be unearthed in this game comes from cheap deaths and its Dickensian workhouse stinginess in serving up more lives. As for the former, many enemies and bosses will utilise some sort of offensive tactic that you have no feasible way of avoiding on your first encounter. On the flip side though, once you've accrued knowledge of their trickery, many of these attacks are laughably easy to skirt, and will never trouble you after their initial surprise factor wears off. The over-reliance of these artifices is a major contributor to the overall lack of challenge in the game, as it only takes a few runs before you'll find yourself dodging these most trivial of bombardments without second thought. As for extra lives, there is only a single 1-up in the game to supplement the initial 3 with which you're granted. Even this single extend is quite easy to miss, only being found in the last level by destroying the mid-boss, who has a tendency to egress unless you unleash a barrage of bombs. So if you don't have any handy in that moment, you're probably out of luck. Scoring is also a rather basic affair. Points are awarded for destroying enemies, as well as collecting bonus items that can be found throughout the game, some being easier to discover than others. Select levels do host a few secrets that allow for greater point scoring opportunities. Destroying the mid-boss quickly in the first stage will spawn additional asteroids and an extra bomb, whereas holding back your fire on the stage 2 mid-boss will give it time to crush a bunch of buildings, revealing otherwise inaccessible bonus items. At the end of each stage, you will receive an additional bonus based on the number of these point-giving items you found, as well as how many bombs you have left over. This does give an incentive to try and hoard bombs, rather than using them as an easy out for surviving some situations, so the classic risk-reward dynamic is present here, and while I state this is a very easy game, I do so as someone who will happily nuke their way through the more challenging moments, foregoing the extra points. So if you are looking to maximise your score in Gekirindan, then fully learning the attack patterns of mobs and bosses alike is imperative. Again, this simplistic mechanic may come as a disappointment to the more experienced, hoping for a meatier system to learn and get creative with ways to inflate their score. It does fit with the more basal gameplay and softer difficulty though, allowing newcomers to easily understand which of their actions have the biggest contribution to their points total. With score not having any tangible impact on the game itself, beginners can focus on simply getting to the end of the game and not be apprehensive about whether using a bomb will prevent them from getting the necessary points for an extend. Then, after getting the knack for survival, more granular work can be done to push that high score ever upwards. Like with the gameplay, nothing about the presentation shines here, but to call it bad would be dishonest of me. The stage designs take full advantage of the time travel centric plot, with each one having a distinctive look and unique enemies. The periods of time selected are those that have seen the most representation in shooters: World War II, present day, and the distant future. I think the game was going for a greatest hits compilation vibe, and while it's neat to see this game make reference to other works in the genre, it could also be construed as derivative. Throughout the 5 brisk stages, nothing ever felt repeated, and the varied environments assisted in learning the stage layouts and knowing when and where certain enemies would appear. Gekirindan does flirt with some more advanced graphics, but only for the deceitful practice of making the game look more technically advanced than it actually is. The first stage features a large, rotating 3D structure, obviously featured at the beginning of the game to hook arcade goers. This is evident as after the opening level, nothing quite like this appears again. The sprite work is good, bosses are large and full of detail, and have a reasonable amount of creativity in their design, but nothing that can be defined as memorable. Despite appearing ad nauseum throughout the game, Huge Boss is a generic mech, whose design only breaks out into something of interest during its final form. There are some problems with the colour choices though, with explosions and enemy fire often employing the same tones of red and orange. Bullets can end up being camouflaged by player-induced devastation, leading to a cheap death. While the game fares well enough graphically, the soundtrack is a bit of a disappointment. With music composed by 2 members of Zuntata, and the game's producer, Osamu Lee Ota, himself being a composer, a certain expectation of the auditory department is developed, but not met. While the music itself isn't bad, there is only a single composition, rearranged for each stage. The lone piece is actually fairly decent, with its stage 4 interpretation being my favourite, but after hearing the same music over and over, it won't be long before the feeling of monotony sets in. It's a shame that each stage doesn't have its own unique theme. With the varied periods of time that the levels take place in, Gekirindan provided an opportunity for numerous instruments and musical styles to be used that could have matched the eras of their accompanying levels, yet said opportunity sadly went squandered. While not a major hit, Gekirindan did receive some console ports. Firstly up to bat was the Saturn, which should have been able to handle a game like this with relative ease, but with development not being handled in-house at Taito, those duties instead being performed by Virgin Interactive, we got a less than stellar result. While not an unplayable version by any means, there are some major graphical downgrades, additional load times, and, more importantly, severe vertical wobble. While I mentioned earlier how enemies who weren't visible on the x-axis wouldn't attack, the opposite is true here, with many shots coming at you from foes that you can't see when the game isn't played in Tate mode. The other port is part of the Taito Legends 2 compilation set for PS2, Xbox and Windows. While a better effort than the Saturn's offering, with some previously absent graphical flourishes now restored, this version lacks any screen rotation options. As far as availability is concerned, the Saturn version is as expensive as you would expect a Saturn game to be, but Taito Legends is a very cheap purchase for those who just want to add a shooter to their collection. The arcade original is still the best experience you're going to get, which will mean emulation for most people. Gekirindan didn't have much of a hope with making an impression with contemporaneous STG fans if you look at what it was going up against at the time. Toaplan's own Batsugun released just a couple of years prior, and marked a shift towards the more bullet hell style of game that would go on to dominate the genre. 4 months prior to its release, Cave made their shooter debut with Donpachi, which built upon the work that was laid out by Batsugun, providing far more enticing gameplay than the practically atavistic Gekirindan. It was also around this time that Saikyo were coming into their own with titles such as Gunbird and Strikers 1945, both of which are leagues ahead of what Taito put out. To conclude, Gekirindan is an exceedingly average shooter that doesn't do a whole lot terribly wrong, but also is so devoid of any originality that there is little reason to play it today for most. I can still give it a mild recommendation for beginners who want an easier game that won't overwhelm them with challenging gameplay and intricate scoring systems and mechanics. Disappointing would be the single word that I think best summarises the game, as with the talent involved, you would have expected better in every facet. I surmise that this game may have suffered from a lack of budget, which would explain the very generic action and lack of musical diversity. Still, if you want an easy 1cc that you might not have played before, or are looking at getting into the genre, Gekirindan certainly isn't a waste of your time. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Until the next episode, please wait warmly.